Thank you for coming, and it's just about, well, it's a little after 2 o'clock, and I don't want to keep people. We said 2 o'clock, and I'm going to begin. Let me just introduce myself first. My name is Michael Vecchione, and you're going to be listening to me, hopefully, for the next 2 hours. If you're not listening any longer, then that's okay. Just close your eyes and the sign on the door says "body thief" as the topic of the speak today, and it's close. It's actually body part thief, and I'll get into all of that when I get into my talk. But let me first begin by telling you about me and why I know this stuff, and why hopefully you'll understand how I got to the point where I was able to supervise and work on this particular case. I'm an attorney and have been for more years than I care to count at this point. And for 30 of those years, I was a prosecutor in the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. 2 different stints. In between, I was in my own practice for 10 years. I worked for the police department for a couple of years. So I've been around true crime. I've been around real crime for over 40 years. And when I left the DA's office after about my first stint, after about 7.5 years. I graduated from Hofstra Law School. I was in the first class that Hofstra graduated. And I got a job at the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office where I had interned for a summer. And I loved it. I mean, it was the bug to be involved in law enforcement, and to be involved as a prosecutor bit me at that point, and I never forgot it. When I graduated, I had a job offer at the Manhattan DA's office, the Bronx DA's office, the Brooklyn District Attorney's office, but I had interned in Brooklyn, and I was born and raised in Brooklyn, so that's where my heart was, and I took the job there. I spent 8.5 years there, and I left. I was Deputy Bureau Chief of the Sex Crimes Bureau. But it was time. You know, I'm embarrassed to even say this. I started out making $11,500 a year. And then when I passed the bar, I got the big raise my big raise went to $13,000 a year. And I was married, I had a child. There was no way I could afford to continue on a salary of $13,000 a year. And my friend from the DA's office had become the Deputy Commissioner of Trials in the New York City Police Department, and that was the chief judge. And they were looking for a prosecutor to take over their prosecution office. And I interviewed with Commissioner McGuire, Bob McGuire, and got the job, and I did that for a couple of years. And then after that, we left together and went to open up our own practice of law, and I did that for the next 10 years. He left, went off into politics, and I was left alone, and I got a call from a friend of mine at the new DA. Joe Hines had been elected, and they were looking for people to try cases, and they asked me if I wanted to come back, and I said yes. I had had enough of private practice. I had enough of chasing clients for money. It was just incredible. It was really a bad situation. I always tell people private practice would be great if it wasn't for the clients, and that's actually true. So I was supposed to start in January of 1982, and 1992. And before I stepped foot in the office, I had gotten a promotion. I said, wow, I became Deputy Chief of the Homicide Bureau. 3 months later, I was Chief of the Homicide Bureau. Couple of years after that, I was Chief of Trials, all the trials in the office. And then in 2001, April 2001, I became Chief of the Rackets Division in the Brooklyn DA's office. And in each of those positions, I did cases that sometimes boggled my mind, and when I was speaking to friends and relatives about some of the things I did, they said, nah, that's not possible. And I'll give you an example. I did a case once involving a fisherman in Brooklyn who hooked a plastic bag, that contained a human skull. And myself and a detective friend of mine put the case together, and we ultimately found out who he was. He was a male. who killed him and prosecuted him. As a result of that prosecution, I had a hit put out on me by the mob because the guy was a mobster, and it was surreal, quite frankly. I had bodyguards, it was the whole 9 yards. I also, as a defense attorney, represented a famous actor who, believe it or not, was arrested for assault of a bouncer in a bar in Manhattan because the bouncer was trying to stop him and his friends from being involved in a food fight. Now, you just can't make it up. It's someone who is now, I won't give you his name, but you could not possibly believe that he would be involved in this kind of thing. But he was, at that point, he was a kid, although we were both kids because he's about a year older than me. But that was another thing that happened. I represented a cop, female cop who posed naked in a men's magazine. I prosecuted a guy, this is one of the bizarre ones, who was posing for years as his dead mother. Oh. And when I say posing, I literally mean posing. He would dress in her clothes, he would put on a wig, her shawl, put on glasses, and his point was to steal her Social Security checks. And why he needed to dress up? Well, he had to keep up the facade, and she had a driver's license. He went to the Motor Vehicle Bureau dressed as he was. I mean, it was just incredible. And when we finally were able to get the case, and my detective said, listen, this guy, he says his mother will talk to us. Now, we had already found her grave. So I said, okay, let's go talk to this guy. And they videotaped it. And there he was, dressed with in her dress, with her glasses. But you know what he did? He thought he was slick. He had an oxygen mask on and claimed that Mom was ill. So, you know, I thought that you couldn't get much more bizarre than that. But I also prosecuted a guy another mobster. And when the witness against him was on the witness stand, he answered a question that was, I don't remember the question, but the answer was, no, I know the guy very well. And we said, okay, I figured he knows him from the neighborhood. No, it wasn't that. The mobster was gay. And he forced this witness not to succumb to his proclivities, for lack of a better term, but the mobster wanted to perform oral sex on this witness on a regular basis. I thought that I really had heard everything by that point. Mobsters, first of all, are not involved, are not gay, and if they are, they certainly keep it safe. This guy, in open court, admitted to doing this. So, you see how many really weird things that I've gone through, and I haven't even scratched the surface. But the story I'm about to tell you really kind of takes the cake. I had never been involved in a case as bizarre as the one that involves the people that I'm going to talk about and the body thief that I'm going to talk about. It all started one very quiet afternoon. I was working on a case involving, I was prosecuting 2 Supreme Court judges in Brooklyn, and we were involved in the investigation. And I'm sitting at my desk, and an assistant DA who worked for me in the Rackets division walked in. His name is Josh Hanshaft. He's now a judge in New York City. And he was riding that day. Now, you might say, well, what does that mean, riding? Well, we had a system where every day in the Rackets division, an assistant district attorney was on call for 24 hours. He or she was at the beck and call of the police department, lawyers, witnesses, complainants, and if there was a problem that needed to be handled by Rackets, that particular individual, the riding DA, was the guy or woman who would talk to the person, and then we would go from there, depending upon whether or not we wanted to open up an investigation or handle it some other way. So Josh was riding that day, and he walked into my office, and I said, Josh, what's up? He says, listen, Mike, I'm riding. I got a woman in my office and a detective, and it's a little strange. I said, okay, tell me all about it. Well, the woman's name was Deborah Johnson. The detective is Patricia O'Brien from the 63rd Precinct in Brooklyn. And Miss Johnson was the now brand new purchaser of a funeral home in Brooklyn, the Daniel George Funeral Home in Bensonhurst. And she went over the books when she purchased it, and she bought it from a guy named Joseph Nicelli, who I'll get into in a couple of minutes. And she soon knew there was something strange. She couldn't put her finger on it. But as she began to work and began to operate the funeral home, she was getting calls and people visiting her saying, well, I'm here for, my mom died, my father died, my sister died, I'm here for the funeral I paid for. She said, what? They said, yeah, we paid Nicelli for the funeral. $300,000 worth of prepaid funerals was no longer in the books of the accounts of the Daniel George Funeral Home. Johnson found out, obviously realized that she had been taken, and went to the police department. The police, as they are wont to do, white collar crime, no, let's go to the DA's office, they'll handle it. So Detective O'Brien and she came to the DA's office, sat down with Josh, and she tells Josh this story, Johnson does. And then as an aside, just as a kind of throwaway line, she said, you know, when I was walking through the building, inspecting it and looking around, I came upon a room that I didn't even know existed. And I walked in, and I found two men in surgical garb standing over a coffin with a body in it. And she didn't know who these guys were. She had not met them before. Nicelli never told her anything about this. And she walked over to them. She just, introduced herself. What are you guys doing? One of them said, well, we're taking the bones out of this body. She said, what? I said, yeah, we're taking the bones out of this body. So she didn't really know what to do at that point. She kind of, okay, that was kind of her attitude. She was more interested at that point in collecting her $300,000 than she was with doing anything with regard to these guys taking bones. So Josh, however, walked in, told me this little story, and he said, Mike, what do you want me to concentrate on? The embezzlement of $300,000 or the taking bones from out of these bodies? I said, Josh, you kidding me, right? I said, of course we're gonna deal with the bone thieves. I mean, let's find out what this is all about. The $300,000 can wait. We can always do that case, and that's what we did. Now, I looked into who was Deborah Johnson, because when you do a case like this, you have to kind of look at the complainant or the person providing the information as much as the people they're complaining about. Johnson was she and her estranged husband owned funeral homes throughout the country. And they bought Daniel Jones in Brooklyn. It was their first, Daniel George, their first one in New York and in Brooklyn. They paid Nicelli $1.5 million for the business. And Nicelli, obviously, he never told anybody, never told her, as I said before, about the $300,000 that he owed her. And, he didn't say anything to her about the secret room, which is what we're going to talk about in a few minutes. This room that this woman came upon in the funeral home. And at the time, I really never knew what she was talking about, and never had the concept in my head of what she could mean by a secret room until I went there at some point. After we'll get to it, but I did go to the Daniel George Funeral Home, and I discovered what she was talking about. So Johnson was told that we would open up an investigation, and we did. And I thought at that point, and I was right, that this was going to be something big. And not that Josh wasn't capable of handling it, but there was too much work that I foresaw was going to happen, and I assigned another assistant DA Her name is Trish McNeil, and they were two of the best people I had in Rackets to do this. And I told them, listen, you guys are going to be the everyday people who are handling this, but I am going to personally supervise the case, and I want to be kept apprised of everything that you do. And in fact, before you do something, I want to know about it, because I want to be able to say that I gave you the okay to do it. They said, fine. So the first thing we looked at was Joseph Naselli, the seller of the funeral home. And we found that his family had a long history in the funeral home business in Brooklyn. And Naselli, in the trade, was known as a trade embalmer. And he worked in that capacity as an embalmer in various funeral directors all over the city. And he was a funeral director himself at Daniel George. Now, his industry contacts in the mortuary industry were spread all over the city as well as all over the country, because he handled situations where there might be a deceased in Brooklyn, but their family was in, let's say, California, and he had to arrange transportation to California and everywhere in the country. So he was in contact with many people across the United States who were in this business. There was also a hint, and I'm going to say a hint because we never really nailed it down, although I'm fairly certain that I was right about this, that Naselli was mobbed up, that he had a connection to organized crime. Where the funeral home was is Colombo territory, and it's nobody can tell me different in terms of what's talked me out of this. Naselli was in some way, shape, manner, or form mobbed up. That $300,000 did not just disappear into Naselli's pocket. I'm sure it went to people that he was in business with. And something later happens in the case that kind of convinced me that I was right about Naselli. So we started to look into Naselli a lot more carefully and a lot more deeply, and we discovered that he had strong ties to an oral surgeon, at that point the former oral surgeon, by the name of Michael Mastromarino. Now Mastromarino was at that point a disgraced oral surgeon, and Naselli and he had business together, and you'll understand the depth and breadth of that business when I get deeper into the story. So who is Michael Mastromarino? Well, I told you that he was an oral surgeon, and when you looked at him, and when I ultimately looked at him, I said, there's just no way this is the guy who we're arresting. He looked like an all-American boy. He was 42 years old, tall, handsome. He was a star football player at the University of Pittsburgh, and he was so good that when he graduated from Pitt, he was ticketed for the NFL. He was that good, except that he did something to his ankle that ended his football career. He hurt his ankle and could certainly never get to the NFL. So he went into the School of Dentistry at NYU, and he did very, very well there. And he was really a personable guy. And if he walked in here right now, you'd say there's no way that this guy could possibly do the things that I will tell you that he did in a little while. It's he was just kind of perfect. And as they say, nobody's perfect, but this guy liked to project the idea that he was somebody who butter wouldn't melt in his mouth. Well, right out of dental school, he made a name for himself. He was extremely talented, extremely popular in terms of his business, which was oral surgery. He built a very lucrative practice in New Jersey, which is where he lived, and as well as in the rest of the tri-state area. And to kind of put the cherry on the top of the sundae, he wrote a very, very well accepted and reviewed book called Smile: How Dental Implants Can Transform Your Life. And it was a bestseller among the community, among his colleagues, and I remember we got the book and had this great cover, and it was kind of an interesting situation that the guy who we were about to arrest at that point had done what he had done in terms of this business. So he really was very popular, and he had a great practice. He bought a mansion in Fort Lee, New Jersey, where he lived with his wife Barbara, and their 2 sons. And keep Barbara in your head, because there's a little something at the end of my talk about Barbara that I'll tell you about. And he boasted at that point to his friends that he was making well over $1 million a year in his practice. Now, we're talking about when we got the case, as I said before, it was around 2005. So he had been an oral surgeon well before he began to take bones out of people's bodies. So he had been around for a good period of time. So $1 million a year is a pretty good practice at that point. But he had lots of demands on his time. Lots of demands because of his fame. He became famous in his community, and those demands really got to him, caused him to kind of get to the point where he felt put upon all the time. In addition to his business, in addition, he had to deal with people who wanted him for interviews and things of that nature, and his practice was through the roof. So, in order to keep up, he began to use drugs. And he began abusing a drug that is called Demerol. And Demerol is basically a preoperative medication used to support anesthesia. And it's an opioid painkiller, essentially. And when we looked at what this does to someone who becomes an abuser, an addict, and it's easily addicted, it's easily abused, and it's easily misused. And Mastromarino fit all 3 of those situations. Now, he had access to Demerol because, as I said, he was a surgeon, and he had people under anesthesia all the time. He used the Demerol as that preoperative drug. And it was a simple thing for him to give himself a shot anytime he wanted it, and ultimately it led to his downfall. He was so addicted that he would use and inject himself before his medical procedures, after his medical procedures, and sometimes during his medical procedures. Tell you 2 stories, which resulted 2 instances, which resulted in malpractice lawsuits filed against him. In one instance, he anesthetized a patient who was about to undergo the oral surgery. And keep in mind, remember, he was involved in implant surgery, which is how he got involved in ultimately stealing bones later on. So she's on the table or in the chair, and she's anesthetized, she's out. And he says to his assistant, I'll be right back. I'm going to leave. So he left. 5 minutes passes. 10 minutes passes. 20 minutes passes. Where the hell is Dr. Mastromarino? So she goes into his office. It's not in his office, but she went into the bathroom, his bathroom in his office. He was out cold on the bathroom floor with a hypodermic needle in his hand. You didn't think it could get any worse. I didn't, except, let me tell you about the second incident, the one that is the final straw to Mastromarino's ability to continue his business. He was in the middle of a surgical procedure, as I said before, obviously high or under the influence. And while the patient was in the chair, he was working on, I don't remember if it was a man or a woman, let's say her. he fell asleep. He fell asleep in the middle of the procedure. Well, it didn't go over too well with the patient. Obviously, she sued him. The medical board in New Jersey, where he was licensed, found out about it. He had been suspended for previous incidents, and this time they revoked his license. He was out. Now, with the loss of that license, he couldn't live the life that he was accustomed to. He couldn't support his wife, now 2 kids, and take care of and be able to continue to live in that mansion in Fort Lee. He had to find something that was going to substitute the amount of money that he was making, in his practice. And he was beside himself at that point. He had hit rock bottom because he couldn't find it right away. He really was gone. He had told his colleagues and told friends, and I found out later on, his wife, that, I don't know what I'm going to do. And I think that people thought at that point that he was going to commit suicide, but he was too much of an egotist to commit suicide. So, to reestablish himself, he called upon something that he became very familiar with because of his dental work and his dental practice. He had performed hundreds of dental procedures, surgical procedures involving bone and tissue, taken from sources, human sources, and transplanted into patients. And every time I read that sentence, which I wrote and I have written many times, I remember sitting in a dentist chair myself, not that long ago, and the dentist saying to me, "You need an implant." I said to him, you're kidding me. I said, "No, you need an implant." I said, "So what are you going to do?" So she said to me, "Well, let me check your bone structure and see if." So she said, "Your bone structure is okay, we can do this." I said, "Thank God." Because God knows I could have had a pig's bone stuck in there, or some poor guy who, died, and the bones from Mastromarino might be still laying around. I didn't want that to happen. So he used that knowledge, the idea that bone and tissue were necessary for these surgical procedures, to begin and to start a new company. He called it Biomedical Tissue Services, which was a human tissue recovery firm. And you'll understand what that is in a few seconds, because he had to deal with outside companies in order to make the money that he was looking for. He knew, obviously, from his profession, that these kinds of things, bone and tissue, were in great demand. Great demand. There was a shortage of them all the time. Doctors were always concerned that they would not have enough, would not have what they need for a particular operation, be it an implant, whether it was a transplant. It was just something that Mastromarino knew was necessary, and that the amount of bone and tissue around for this was always in short supply. So his idea was he came up with this idea, and I'll call it Plan A, because there is a Plan B. Plan A was to work through funeral homes and with funeral directors all across, first, the tri-state area. Then he told us about Philadelphia, upstate New York, and then later I'll tell you about across the pond, actually across the pond and across Europe into Asia. He was hooked up with these funeral directors and told them that he wanted them to find bone and tissue for him, and that he would buy it. Now, what they had to do in order to do that is to ask, funeral directors needed to They needed to ask family members who had brought in a deceased whether or not they would give permission to this Mastromarino guy to take the bone and tissue that he needed for, for his business. And of course, the funeral director would be paid for every time someone said, yes, you can do that. Now, if they said yes, then Mastromarino and his assistants would jump in the car, drive to the funeral home, and then begin the harvesting process. Now, we discovered at that point, because I knew nothing about this business, but we ultimately discovered that the human bone and tissue industry in the United States was worth well over $1 billion a year. That's how lucrative it was. One human body is worth over $100,000 in harvested bone and tissue. Bones, I've said that a million times, so bones was one thing. Veins, tendons, and other body parts were used by surgeons in all kinds of operations to repair fractures, to do implants, and clearly the dental implant surgery was the big one that needed the bone, because if the bone in your jaw that they were supposed to implant the new tooth into had deteriorated or wasn't sufficient enough to hold it, what they would do is they would cut out that piece and they would put in a piece of bone that Mastromarino would sell to these processing companies. The processing companies would sell it to a dentist, and bone knits. So the key is you put the piece of bone in, whatever procedure they have to do to make it, and you wait until the bone knits, and then it's hard enough to be able to, and strong enough to be able to take the implant. So that was his thought. He offered, Nicelli was one of them, of course, as well as the other funeral directors that he approached, $1,000 for every body that they were able to put, to kind of get him to operate on. Now, when we first heard about this stuff, I said, is it legal to do this?
I'm just going to ask that.
Is it legal? And it turns out it is legal. It is legal. You can have someone have their bone and tissue taken out legally. But there's two and a half requirements. The first is that you need permission from the family member of the deceased to essentially cut the body open and take out what they need. And the second is that the person who you're operating on, I'll call it operating, can't have died of a communicable disease, HIV, hepatitis, cancer, nor could the person have been too old for the bones to be viable. And the cutoff age was 75 years old. Now, he figured that with the kind of money that these products were worth, that he would be back in the fast lane. He was thinking millions. Until funeral directors that he approached would consistently get back to him and say, I have a body. I talked to the family. And guess what? The answer is no. Every single person that was asked, the answer was no. Nobody wanted to have their loved one cut up and have their body parts separated, divided up, and used. Not so much they were against using it to help people, but what it would mean to their loved one who had died and was now intact. Until Mastromarino would get to him and he would no longer be, or she would no longer be intact. So he was faced with defeat, and Mastromarino didn't take defeat very easily. So he went to Plan B. And Plan B turned him into one of the most notorious criminals in the history of New York State. He became known when we exposed him in the media as a ghoul, a body snatcher, and a monster. And believe me, those were kind words to him. He was worse than all of that. So let me tell you a little bit about the investigation. So I've explained to you about Naselli, explained to you who Mastromarino is. The investigation obviously required more than just Josh and Trish McNeil. So what we did was we put together a team of detectives from the DA's office and the NYPD's major case squad, because a lot of ground had to be covered. They did the work that I just talked about in terms of digging into Naselli and Mastromarino and biomedical tissue services, and interviewed dozens of people connected to all three of those entities. People connected to funeral directors who Mastromarino had gone to for this, and asked about having bodies. And also we found, because we uncovered records which indicated who the bodies were that Mastromarino had finally gotten to cut open, and we went to family members and spoke to them. So it took a lot of legwork. Detectives were working all the time, and they would come back, and Josh would write reports about what they had discovered in all parts of this investigation. And I have to tell you that I saved these reports because I was involved in, as I said before, a couple of cases involving Supreme Court judges, corrupt judges who ultimately I wound up putting in jail, an FBI agent, a corrupt FBI agent, two corrupt New York City Police Department detectives. So I was involved in a lot of things at the time. So I saved the reading of these reports until the evening. It was like, I thought when I started to read them that it was like I was in a library, stuck in a library reading horror novels. It was unbelievable. But what they were telling me was all real. Everything that they wrote in those reports, they learned and had actually happened. So we even went back then in time to see, were there other situations like this in history? And there were. And one that kind of stakes out, and it's an interesting case. It's from the 1800s in London. At that time, doctors were in the early stages of learning about anatomy, learning about the body, and also learning how to conduct and to do surgical procedures. So the surgical procedures and learning about the anatomy obviously required human bodies for them to do research on, and to look at, and to examine. And as I told you, in the United States, the legal supply of cadavers, which in England were mostly executed criminals, could not keep up with the pace that these researchers were involved in, and the pace that medical scholars were involved in terms of doing this now work that we all take for granted. I mean, this work laid the groundwork for the surgical procedures that we undergo today with complete safety. So the need for cadavers in England, kind of as it usually does, created financial opportunities for bad guys or bad ladies. They were called body snatchers, grave robbers, or politely they were known as resurrectionists. Imagine that, resurrectionists. And one famous case that we discovered, and I'll tell you about it, it's two guys, someone named William Burke and another one named William Hare. And they weren't body snatchers. They weren't grave robbers, nor were they resurrectionists. They were murderers. So in the past, these doctors would pay for bodies that were dug up, bodies that were, had been in funeral homes, etc. Well, in this situation with these two guys, they had one medical doctor who worked at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Robert Knox was his name. And he wanted bodies, and Burke and Hare accommodated him. They murdered 16 people and turned the bodies over to Dr. Knox for his experimentation and his study. When the police arrested Burke and Hare, they were able to turn, which is the key to all prosecutions. Well, I should say all, but a lot of them, is to get somebody to turn. Right, Bruce? Yes, sir. So they convinced Hare to turn. Now, why they chose Hare as opposed to Burke, I have no idea. But Hare, faced with what I'm about to tell you happened to Burke, said, okay, I'll cooperate. And he cooperated. And he testified, and Burke was convicted, and he was sent to the gallows. He was executed. So Hare literally saved his hair. Dr. Knox, never criminally charged. Amazing. We think about today about the elites and who kind of walk away from prosecutions and not prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Well, I guess back then it was the same kind of thing, where this professor at University of Edinburgh was given a walk, was allowed to escape. So that was kind of an interesting thing, and I had never known anything about Hare or Burke and the resurrectionists, but I always think now about that title, resurrectionists, as if it was Jesus being resurrected from the grave on Easter morning, but that's not what they were talking about. So the investigation was really kind of, every time we spoke to someone, the investigation kind of took on an even bigger persona, and aura, I should say. And every time, as I said before, a detective or Josh or Trish would come back and talk to me about this. Sometimes I would shake my head, and the hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and it was like, I was in a Twilight Zone episode. And it was really just unbelievable. They examined, and we examined, thousands of documents recovered from biomedical tissue. Now, they had been in business for a while, remember, so can you imagine how many of these illegal activities they had done by the time we got to them? They found in other locations, funeral homes, etc., forms that I guess were supposed to be the excuse for why a body was taken out of, let's say, Daniel George, turned over to Mastromarino, and they took his bones and tissue. Well, the forms were consent forms, and of course, as I said before, in order to make this quote unquote legal, a consent form had to be filed with the body parts, or sent with the body parts down to the processing companies where the bone and tissue was cleaned and processed and then made ready for a doctor. So let me explain a little bit about the processing companies. We found that these companies are all over, particularly the southern part of the United States. I don't know why, but they were all, the ones we dealt with were all down south. And they were legitimate companies. And what they did was, what they would do and what their business was they would take or receive from people like Mastromarino, biomedical tissue, samples of blood, pieces of bone, samples of tissue, and blood I'll get into in a second. And they would essentially process them. First they would check to see whether or not, there was permission. Then they would check to see what the cause of death was, because there was a death certificate that accompanied the body parts. They would check a a vial of blood that was supposed to go with the body parts as well, and determine whether or not it was okay. Everything was cool. And then once they did that, they would process the bone and tissue and make it ready for a doctor who needed a sample or a piece of bone, let's say for an implant surgery, or someone broke a leg and a piece of bone needed to be knitted and put into the leg. There were many, many uses for it. So that's what the processing companies were. And they were very, very, I should say, careful about the consent forms, very, very careful about the death certificates, very careful about the vials of blood, because obviously they were in a business that was a big moneymaker and they didn't want to jeopardize their licenses. So when the detectives found these consent forms, and I'm talking about hundreds, they came to me and they said, "Mike, we got all of these. It looks like maybe this guy's legit." I said, "Really? Here's what you're going to do. Let's start in Brooklyn. You're going to take the forms and divide them up, and we're going to take the Brooklyn cases. There were like 1,000 cases in Brooklyn. And you're going to go to every single household, and you're going to knock on the door. You're going to show whoever answers the door this consent form and ask them whether or not it's legit. Did they give consent? Is that your signature? Is that a family member's signature?" And they did that. Guess how many were correct? They then had the death certificates. You say, well, death certificate, doctor. Files a death certificate and fills it out, etc. They took the death certificates. So they would go to, let's say, a particular home. I'll just use this. Mrs. Smith passed away. According to the death certificate, she died in an automobile accident. That was the really big one. There were like thousands of automobile accidents that we found. Of course, when they asked the family what she died of, well, she had cancer. Or she had, in some instances, had contracted hepatitis or communicable disease. Every single death certificate was forged. Every single one. And who forged them? Mastromarino's people. So it became apparent that we were really making headway in terms of this case. And it came into focus. Plan B came into focus at this point, because we still thought, well, maybe there's something legit here. Certainly not after all these forms, but when we got to the form part, we were still uncertain. So we were able to figure out that Plan B was something that we were now involved in looking at very carefully. This is what it was. Pay a funeral director for a body. No permission to gut it? No problem. We'll just forge a consent form. Cause of death for that body, a communicable disease, HIV, hepatitis, cancer? No problem. We'll forge the death certificate. The deceased was of, advanced age, brittle bones, deteriorated tissue. No problem. We'll make a difference. The death certificate, we'll even forge a birth certificate if we have to. Then cut the body up, ship it to other parts to the processing companies throughout the country with the forged permission slip, the forged death certificate. Collect $4 million a year. That's what Mastromarino made in this business. $4 million a year. He had hit the jackpot. Now, I mentioned blood. There's another part of this, what the processing companies require. When you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. When Mastromarino would send the bone and tissue to the processing company, along with the permission slip, the death certificate, and any other document that they required, they wanted a vial of what they called clean blood. Now, obviously, Mastromarino could not send a vial down to the processing companies of someone who had died of, let's say, HIV, but the death certificate said an automobile accident. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Because when we looked at these things, I had a bunch of them on my desk. I said, how many friggin' automobile accidents were there during this particular time? I didn't say friggin', you can tell what I actually said. And I said, Mike, it's simple. Somebody dies in an automobile accident, no one gives a shit about whether or not he had HIV or whatever. The doctor says he died in an automobile accident from trauma. So he couldn't take the blood out of, let's say, that body. So what he did was he had, believe it or not, and he carried this around in a duffel bag, vials of clean blood. Where did he get them from? Sons, wife, other people who he knew were healthy, his cutters, the guys that would cut the body open. And when he would send the questionable body parts down to the medical, to the processing companies, one of those clean vials would go with it. Now, how do we know about that? Well, we at some point in the investigation, we got a search warrant for his home and his office. And in the garage behind his home, we found, it was as if we walked into a butcher shop. Freezers, the kind of freezers that you would use to store your meat. Freezers full of body parts. Freezers full of blood samples. And that's how we then got to the point of understanding the whole idea of the blood and the clean blood, etc. So this guy was not going to take any chances at all. He knew what he needed to do, and he did it. And he did it no matter what it took. He was able to get it. We had so many people who he cut open that their family members told us had died of the communicable disease situation or cancer, and it was just, just made things so horrible for us to learn all this stuff. And then when you told the family member that the body was cut open, or it was someone, and we'll get to a very famous one, someone who's, let's say, in their mid-90s and dies. Could you imagine being on an operating table having a bone from someone who's 95, 96 years old transplanted into your leg, and you're 40 years old? Well, that's what was going on. That's exactly what was going on. So, when you think about all that this guy did, and particularly after we opened up that garage and saw all those freezers full of body parts and blood vials, man, when I talked about Burke and Hare before, he made them look like amateurs, believe me. He was just off the charts in terms of what he did. So, now, if that wasn't bad enough, if what I told you wasn't bad enough, something else that we discovered was, I say equally, maybe a little bit more shocking. So in interviewing one of the loved ones, one of the family members, a widow, she told us that on the first day of her husband's wake at Daniel George, she, grieving, went up to the coffin and was touching the hand, touching the leg. And she told us that it didn't feel like bone, it didn't feel like flesh. She said, you know what it felt like? Pipe. Like there were pipes in my husband's limbs. Well, it turns out she was right. She was right. We took the info, asked other loved ones who we knew about now, and we got similar answers. We found that Mastromarino and the two men that he had, who were his cutters, that's what we called them, after removing the bone and tissue from, let's say, body's legs, and that body was going to be waked, okay? They loved it when the body was going to be cremated. Then they took everything. But a body who was going to be waked, they needed to make sure that it looked okay. And what did they do? They replaced the bone that they took out with PVC pipe. Went to Home Depot, bought a whole shitload of PVC pipe, and that's what they used. But if it didn't look just right, we also found out that they would then take whatever was around, unfinished lunch, empty paper coffee cups, wrapping for their sandwiches, and they would stuff it into the body to give it some more depth, and then sew it up. So when I told the DA about this, DA Hines, who is no longer with us, he first of all couldn't believe it. And he was disgusted. All of this stuff that most of what I told you about was happening at the Daniel George Funeral Home, not that far from where the DA lived. And he said, when are you, I remember this as if it was yesterday. I was online at DMV. My son had needed me to trade in to turn in his plates from his old car. So I said, listen, I'm on the way to the office. I'll stop. I live in Queens, and I was going to stop in Whitestone, where there's a DMV office, and drop them off. Well, it wasn't that easy. I had to wait online. So I'm online. It's about 10 o'clock, and at that point, this is how long ago it was, my beeper goes off, okay? And, but I did have a cell phone at the time. It's the DA. I called. What's up, boss? He says, where the fuck are you? I said, what are you talking about? I'm in DMV and turning in a plates. He says, don't you have anybody who can do that for you? I said, who do you think I am? You? That I can get some driver to come here and do this stuff? No, I got to do it myself. I said, what's up? He said, when are we locking up Mastromarino? I said, hold, boss, we're not there yet. He said, we got to do something. That's how much my conversation with him affected him. Well, I did turn in the plates, and I did get back to the office. I got Josh and Tricia, and I said, let's get this done. So, every time I think back on this, and I say to myself, as I was writing this talk, I can understand somebody like Hines, who had been around for many, many more years than me, and who had seen what he thought was everything. And I'd go and tell him that there's someone a few blocks away from him that's stuffing some poor cadaver with, their coffee cup or the remnants of their pizza that they had for lunch, and locking him up. I understood his anxiety and his anxiousness to get this done. So I want to tell you a little bit about this secret room where all of this was taking place. So I ultimately, after the arrests, I personally went to Daniel George, and I saw how the bodies, how things work, and the way it worked was this. So Mastromarino would get a call from, let's say, a funeral home in Manhattan. He would send whatever transportation was at his beck and call at the time to that funeral home. He would load the body in, and then they drive it to Brooklyn. Now, they drove it to Daniel George. And the entrance to Daniel George was on a big avenue, but the side street was a smaller street, and the garage where the hearses would pull in was on that side street. And it was behind, the entrance to the garage was behind a kind of a high fence. You really couldn't see unless you opened up the fence and went in. And what would happen is they would drive the hearse into the garage. They would then take the body out, and they would load it onto either a gurney or sometimes just lay it on the floor.
This is in a coffin or just a body?
No, it was the body bag. And they would then, what they laid it on turned out to be like a hydraulic lift from in a garage. It was level with the floor. You couldn't tell it was there. So they put the body on it, hit the button, it would then rise to the ceiling of the garage to the second floor. It looked like couldn't see anything. You'd say, where the hell is this thing going to go? It's going to go into the ceiling. No. There was a secret door that they had cut into the ceiling that if you went into, that when the hydraulic lift came up, the doors opened and allowed it to go into this secret room. After they took the body off the gurney and put it onto their table to do whatever they were going to do with it, they would send their lift back down. If you walked into that room, like I did, and looked at the floor, you would never know that there was a secret trap door there that came from the garage. So that was the secret room, and it was so cleverly disguised that any person, I knew what I was looking for, or at least I thought I did. Anybody else would have said, you guys are crazy, there's nothing going on here. How could they get this body up to, I couldn't transport it, by the way, through the funeral home. The funeral home was operating. People would say, who are you? What are you doing here? Of course not, they had to do it in that way. So it was really kind of an eye-opening situation, and I realized now how they got away with it for as long as they did. So October 6th, 2005 was the beginning of the end for Mastromarino and his people. Many months after the investigation began, the DA's press officer, Jerry, our friend Jerry Schmetterer, who's no longer with us, Jerry gets a call from a reporter for the New York Daily News. The reporter had been tipped off to our investigation. Believe it or not, up until this point, the only people who knew about this investigation were the detectives and ADAs who worked on it, my boss and myself, no one else. We were able to keep it secret. It was important that we kept it secret because we didn't know who knew who. So he gets a call, and the reporter tells him he was tipped off by a source which he would not identify. I can tell you who the source is now. Who kept them informed of this investigation or the progress of the investigation. The source turned out to be the lawyer for Deborah Johnson. Deborah Johnson, the lady who bought Daniel George, was being kept apprised of what was going on from the beginning. So she knew basically from detectives what was going on. So she told her lawyer, who was quite frankly, listen, I'm a lawyer, been a lawyer for a long time. There were some straight lawyers, there were some sleazy lawyers. And this guy was looking for publicity. He had sat around for months representing Johnson. We were doing the investigation of the century with body parts and all kinds of stuff, and he was getting nothing. He was getting no press, no accolades, nothing for bringing this to us. So he had enough. So he went to Bill Sherman, was the reporter. And Sherman told Jerry, my buddy Jerry, everything that he knew about this investigation. And what he knew was everything we had done up to that point in the investigation. Everything. Jerry calls me and says, Mike, you're not going to believe this. He tells me, he said, Sherman's got this story, and he's going to write it. I said, Jerry, can't we do something? We're almost at the end. Can't we do something to make sure that this, the last thing I wanted was for this to be in the Daily News and blast it all over the city and then try to do an investigation when everybody knows about it. It's very difficult. Mm-hmm. So he said he's going to write it. He said, so listen, here's what I think you should do. You should sit down with him and listen to what he has and make sure that if what he writes is at least accurate, so that we're not, held to something a reporter has written. So find out whether, and I did. I sat down with him. He had everything, and he had everything correct. It was totally, totally accurate. Once Sherman's story appeared in the Sunday Daily News, it was like an earthquake happened in Brooklyn. Every news outlet in the city, the state, all over the country now were inundating Jerry and us with calls. What's going on? Tell us about this. We're interested. We want. It was impossible. So what that did for us is exactly what I was trying to avoid. It put pressure on us now to finish the investigation. A few days later, the United States Food and Drug Administration ordered this is how far it had gone, ordered a recall of body parts from a list of companies that were in Sherman's story as processing companies. They literally said to men and women across the country, if you have received a body part from one of these companies, you need to go to your doctor immediately and have yourself examined. What they were concerned about, obviously, was a bone that was, deteriorated, or a bone from someone who died of HIV or died of hepatitis. Now, later on, well after the case was over, there was a TV show, and it was a very good TV show. I forgot who did it. And in it, there was a story. One of the women who had bone and I forgot what it was. I think it was tissue, maybe bone and tissue, from one of the companies, actually went to her doctor, and the doctor told her, "You got a problem. You're going to have to come to me every 6 months and be examined and tested to make sure that what is in you doesn't get worse than what it was." And this was she was not the only person. She's the only one who was willing to be interviewed by the reporters and for this TV show, but she was not the only one. It was, again, one of these things where the DA is now saying to me, "I know you were at the DMV with those plates, and you told me everything was good. Well, listen, now we really need to get this thing done. You see what's going on. We really have to close, we have to get this under control." I said to him, "Wait, we need one more thing." Josh had come to me and said, "Listen, Mike, we know people told us about the PVC pipe. Shouldn't we find out and look for evidence that what they told us is accurate?" I said, "Yeah, absolutely. What do you want to do?" He said, "I want to exhume bodies." Now, in order to exhume bodies in New York, you must have permission of a family member. Otherwise, the cemetery tells you basically take a walk. No judge would sign off on an exhumation order unless there was, family consent. We received consent from 6 families to exhume the bodies, which was, to me, a great thing because I only needed 1. 2 is good. 3 was great. 6 was tremendous. Nobody's going to say, "Well, you picked the one body and it was an aberration, etc., and we had permission." By the way, when you put PVC pipe in, it's okay to do that if you have permission the same way with the other. So that was not crime in and of itself. That's why it was important for us to get the evidence that it was done in 6 people who said, "No, you can't do it." So the media, of course, got wind of this exhumation process. Talk about a pain in the rear end. Oh my God. Cemeteries, we were inundated. Cemeteries, they wanted to be at every exhumation. So Jerry, my buddy, would, on behalf of the press, would call the cemetery and say, "Daily News, CBS, NBC, ABC, they want to be at the graveside when the body's exhumed." Cemetery A said no. B, no. C, no. All 6 said no. It was like, thank God. However, because there's always a however, for one exhumation, one enterprising TV station, and I forgot what it was, I just don't remember, hired a helicopter which flew over the gravesite while the coffin was being lifted out of the grave. National news. It was on national news. It was, there was nothing we could do about it. We had everybody, and it was actually very clear. I mean, the helicopter was low enough to be able to see exactly what was going on. That wasn't the worst thing that happened. I know I've done this many times, tell you something and then say something worse. So one of the 6, they're at the gravesite. Of course, we had medical examiner people there, the grave diggers, people from the cemetery, our detectives, Josh, Trish. So they're lifting the coffin out, and somehow it tilted forward. And the body came through the bottom of the end of the coffin. When Josh came back and told me this, I said, my first question was there a helicopter watching or flying overhead? He said, no, there was no helicopter. I said, oh, thank God. I said, Josh, what happened? He said, Mike, the guy operating the crane or whatever it was, it just, he screwed up. So 6 bodies were brought to the city medical examiner's office, x-rayed, and what did we find? PVC pipe in each of the bodies. And this is what it looked like. Hopefully you can see this. These are the x-rays. And they're x-rays of the legs of one of the bodies. And you can see very clearly the pipe.
Highlighted in red.
And it's highlighted in red, thank you to my very talented wife, Lenore, who did this for me. And the other thing we found out, you can't see it as clearly in this, but down here at the ankle, foot, what Mastromarino's people did in order to make sure that the pipe didn't slide away, they put a bolt in through the pipe, in through the ankle bone, so that way the foot stayed in place. So, I mean, when you talk about Frankenstein, it was really like Frankenstein monster. And this, of course, these pictures became, once again, national news. There's one more I want to show you, and it's a little different leg, a little part of the leg. This is Josh at the press conference. This picture is of the pelvis, and you can see where the hip bones, and once again, those bones, PVC pipe. And it was, it's like, again, Frankenstein monster Frankenstein had come to Brooklyn. It was just incredible. So the other thing the exhumation did was, I talked about news people inundating Jerry. Well, families, everybody who we had talked to during the course of the investigation now called my office. They said, when are you going to arrest these people? When is it going to happen? One of the people who called is someone we had interviewed before, because obviously she knew about what was going on. And we interviewed her early on in the investigation. Her name is Susan Cook Kittredge. Lived in Manhattan. She was British. She was the daughter of famed British broadcaster Alistair Cook, a guy who was the host of Masterpiece Theatre. She was one of the first people that we interviewed, because when we went through Mastromarino's records and biomedical tissues records, we found a file marked Alistair Cook. We said, no, it can't be. Well, it turned out it was. So she told us that she had, her father died in Manhattan, and that he wanted to be cremated, and that the body was taken to New Jersey and cremated in New Jersey. That's what she knew. And she said that, she, of course, had never given permission to Mastromarino or his people to do anything to her father's body. And she said, if my dad, it's kind of a non sequitur, but if my dad was alive, he'd be horrified. So her father wanted to be cremated because he didn't want to be in a situation or have his family, mourning for him in a coffin, etc. So she followed his wishes and she had him cremated, took his ashes, and spread them wherever it is that he wanted the ashes spread. And when we told her what this was all about, she said, you know something? Now it makes sense. I said to her, what are you talking about? She said, when I spread my father's ashes, the ashes were like talcum powder. I was expecting grit, maybe pieces of bone, etc. I had no idea that after the cremation it would come out this way. And we told her, well, it wouldn't have. There would be slivers of bone and other things. It's because your father had his bones removed by Mastromarino's people. 94 years old. Once again, you imagine getting that bone from a doctor? I mean, it was just sinful. Well, it was time. February 23rd, 2006, we made arrests. And we held a press conference in the DA's office, a press conference that I will never, ever forget. It was attended by press, all kinds of press, print, TV, radio, anything you could possibly imagine, from literally all over the world. All over the world. We had TV stations, 25 TV stations, who set up for the press conference, and there were TV stations from Europe, Asia, Russia, the United States. There were so many attendees. We had to use 2 big rooms in the DA's office beside our press conference room. We had to literally have wire. We've had to find the only windows in the building that opened, because it was a brand new building basically. And these trucks downstairs had to have wire leading from the trucks. This is before wireless, etc. Down from the 19th floor of the building down to the trucks. It was a surreal situation. Never before or since did we ever have anything like that. And I mentioned Russia. I'll tell you why in a couple of minutes. So Mastromarino was arrested. Nicelli was arrested. The 2 cutters, Lee Crescetta and Christopher Alderossi, they were also arrested and were charged with a range of crimes. Most serious was called enterprise corruption. It was the New York State version of the RICO law. And Mastromarino and his buddies were charged with running this corrupt enterprise. I mean, if there was ever a corrupt enterprise, and if RICO was ever meant anything, this was the enterprise that needed to be charged. And of course, the penalties were life in prison if they were convicted. So, up to life in prison. We charged them with body stealing. Believe it or not, that's a crime in New York. I didn't know that until I started to put the case together and realize what was going on. Opening graves illegally, that's another crime in New York. Unlawful dissection of a body, also a crime in New York. And the one that was very, very familiar to me was forgery. Well, they forged all those death certificates, they forged all those permission slips, etc. And we had concrete proof that they were forgeries. Mastromarino's ring had plundered, we called it, And that's exactly what he did. He plundered more than 1,400 bodies that we found, sold body parts that were distributed to approximately, at that point, that we found, 20,000 recipients between 2001 and 2005. He was operating before 2001. The DA wanted me to handle the arraignment. And the arraignment is in Supreme Court, and it's where the indictment is read, where the defendants are asked how they plead. They're apprised of the charges against them. And the prosecutor is allowed to make a statement along with the defense attorneys in terms of bail and what bail situation should be. You know, I was talking to someone before about bail, about being a prosecutor now, and actually it was Eileen, and I couldn't be a prosecutor now. I couldn't. The way the bail situation is, the way the laws are, I just couldn't do it. I'd be in trouble every day. So I asked for no bail. I asked for them to be held in what's called remand, which means that no matter how much money they put up, they can't get out until a judge says differently. And the judge looked at me and I said, Your Honor, what these people have done is nothing short of medical terrorism. That's what it was. I thought it was pretty, simple to come up with the term, but man, when I got done, of course, every newspaper in the city led with medical terrorism as in their headlines, which was okay. I was happy that I was able to do it. So I'm going to tell you now what ultimately happened. Christopher Alderazzi, was the only one of the four who chose to go to trial. And imagine this idiot thinking that with the evidence that we had, that he could convince a jury. The jury would be people like yourselves, people who had loved ones who died, people who were sick, people, just normal, everyday people. How he would convince them that Alderazzi should be found not guilty of cutting up bodies is beyond me. But he went to trial. Well, guess what happened? A very quick conviction. The judge sentenced him to 9 to 27 years in prison. Now, he wasn't the mastermind. He was just one of the facilitators. Nicelli, old Joseph Nicelli, where we began. He took a plea. Smart. Thought that he'd save himself a number of years in prison. He got 8 to 24 years in prison. He was an elderly guy. But one of the things that happened before the sentence, actually before the plea and the sentence, really kind of sticks in my mind, and it's one of the things I wanted to tell you about my thought about him being connected to organized crime. Allegedly, he was, oh, by the way, when he came in to be sentenced, he was in a wheelchair. I said, what is this all about? Well, his lawyer said, he was doing some work on a roof of his house, and he slipped off the roof of the house. And I said, yeah. And I got a bridge to sell you down the block. Are you kidding me? That $300,000 that he stole, I am sure was supposed to go to the bent noses in Brooklyn. There's no doubt in my mind. So he got 8 to 24. Lee Crocetta. Now, Crocetta pled guilty, and he cooperated with us. He testified against Alderazzi at the trial. Now, that usually means that you're going to get a terrific deal, maybe even no jail. Judge Tomei, Marissa Tomei, the actress? Well, Judge Tomei is her uncle. And Judge Tomei was the judge. Tomei couldn't give a rat's ass about Crocetta testifying. 8 to 24 years in prison for a guy who cooperated. Unheard of. We were all surprised. On March 19th, 2008, Mastromarino pled guilty to running a criminal enterprise that even he admitted to netting himself over $4 million for every year that the enterprise was in business. And it was in business for many years. We had it for at least 4. That's what we did. He was involved before this. So at the plea, I don't know if any of you have ever been in a situation, I hope not, where somebody is pleading guilty to a crime and you're there to observe. But at the plea, Mastromarino sat in a chair just like this at the table, very quietly as Josh Hanshaft and Trish McNeil read out to open court the more than 100 counts of the indictment that we had brought against him. And they also read the names of 24 people whose bodies we chose to use for the prosecution. Those 24 bodies he carved up without permission of the families. All of the families were in court to listen to this. One thing I have to tell you, I've done a lot of cases, a lot of trials. And I have done trials involving, the killing of young people, daughters, sons. Relatives show up, sometimes not as many, sometimes one or two. For the Mastromarino case, even if it was on the calendar to, let's say, do a legal motion or get an answer from a judge, the courtroom was packed with family members every single time. And every time there was a reporter there, they would essentially be interviewed, would tell them how much they wanted Mastromarino to essentially be executed. It was just unbelievable. That's how much support the DA's office received. On the date of the sentencing, 4 weeks later, I should say, the families were in court again. They allowed Josh and Trish to speak on their behalf, as opposed to having 24 families get up and give a victim impact statement. Josh and Trish handled it for them. And they did a brilliant job. They really did. But that wasn't the worst for them. They had to sit and listen to Mastromarino, who was allowed to speak as well, give a half-baked apology, which, needless to say, was not very, very well received. I mean, how do you turn to people and say, I'm so sorry for causing you all of this pain, for causing, your family to have this nightmare in your lives? I mean, every time you go to sleep, you're going to think about what happened to your loved one. Mastromarino was sentenced to 18 to 54 years in prison. Quite frankly, I thought it was a little light.
Yeah.
I thought Tomei was going to hit him with a lot more than that. But, and there's a but, and I'll get to the but in a second. So after the sentencing, his attorney went out into the, as often happens, out into the corridor outside the courtroom. The media, assembled media, I mean, there were like dozens of reporters. And and he interviewed, they asked him about his client and what his client did. And you know what he said? He said that, my client is only guilty of cutting a few corners in his business to make sure that his business operated. Well, Josh was standing there and heard it. And I was next to him. Josh was now interviewed, and Josh said one of the greatest retorts I'd ever heard. He said, Mastromarino did more than cut corners. He cut limbs, he cut legs, he cut arms, and he mutilated bodies for profit and greed. And that's exactly what he did. And I tell you, I was never more proud of Mr. Hanshaft as I was at that particular point. And he's sitting on the bench today, and he deserves, every accolade that you can possibly give him in terms of this case, and so does Trish. But that's not where the story ends. A few years later, with Mastromarino's in jail, and he has an in-person interview with a reporter. And he had, excuse me ladies, the balls to deny that he had done what we charged him with. They said I did this, they said I did that. None of that was true. Problem was, he had done it in Brooklyn. He had done it in Manhattan. He had done it in Rochester, New York. He had done it in New Jersey. He had done it in Philadelphia. In each jurisdiction, he was charged with what we charged him with, or similar charges. and he was found guilty in each and every location. That was not an accident. Not an accident at all. And I mentioned before that I had something to tell you about Asia and Europe. Well, I discovered that if we hadn't stopped him, he had cut a deal with an old age home on the west side of Manhattan. That the old age home was going to tip him off when someone died without a family member, and he was going to take the body and ravage it before it was then buried, maybe in Potter's Field. It got worse. I also found out that he had cut a deal with a Russian prison, and that when prisoners died in this Russian prison, Mastromarino was going to purchase the bodies, and he was going to take them to Germany, where he had a setup, and he was going to take everything that he could out of these prisoners' bodies. I thought I had heard it all, but that was, to me, again, it's not really good icing, but it was the icing on the cake. It was, we did something that I'm very proud of. We took a monster off the streets. We took somebody who shouldn't have even been alive. So let me give you the final wind up here. A few years, again, after Mastromarino went to prison, I get a call from a TV show. And I don't remember the name of it. It was like I Married a Monster or something of that nature on Lifetime TV. And they wanted me to come to be interviewed about Mastromarino. They were going to interview his wife and his kids. And I agreed. So I got in a car, I was working, and I went over to Manhattan, to the west side, and they told me where the studio was. And I got to tell you folks, I drive onto this block, and I'm expecting a TV studio. And it was a block of warehouses. And I finally asked somebody, I said, where is such and such address? He goes, right there. Well, the doors were like that, over there. And I said, what the hell is this? So I walk in, and it's literally the lobby of this warehouse. And I said to the guy, I'm here for this TV show. He goes, oh, it's in the back. So I walk all the way down the hall, get to the spot, and in the back is a little sitting area. There's a little couch, another couch facing the other one, a little table in the middle. There was a vending machine, like a Coca-Cola machine or something there. And there's a woman sitting on the couch. And I walk in and I say, excuse me, is this so-and-so? She goes, yeah, you're in the right place. She says, you're Mike Vecchione, right? I said, yeah, who are you? She said, I'm Barbara Mastromarino. But my name now is Barbara Mastro. She said, I had to change my name because of all of what happened. Now I'm saying to myself, holy shit. Now I'm stuck with this woman in this place. I just put her husband is in jail. He's going to be there for 54 years. I said, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm here to be interviewed. She said, my son's in there right now being interviewed. She said, I hope you will excuse me, but my son doesn't quite care for you. So I am not going to introduce you when he comes out if you're here. I said, that's okay. Yeah, that's fine. She said, I said to her, and I was thinking to myself, well, what about you? You know what she did? What she said to me? She actually thanked me. She thanked me. She said, you did what needed to be done. What this guy did to my family was horrific. He hid everything from us, and now we're all suffering from that. And I thank you. And she said to me, you saved my family.